Well, howdy, everybody, and welcome back to the Conspiracy Farm. Welcome to Why Stanley Kubrick, Volume 1. Today, we're going to talk about his first two major, most influential works, and we'll talk about why he's important, why I think he's the greatest filmmaker of all time. And my choice of words is careful there because he's not really the most entertaining filmmaker of all time. He may not be the most influential or even the most popular filmmaker of all time. But I think he's great because of the sheer quality of his films, the detail involved, his obsession with the craft of film. The other cool thing I like about Stanley Kubrick is he's just sort of pure talent out of nowhere. He started off as a lowly staff photographer for Life magazine. He grew up as just an ordinary-looking guy from the Bronx. He always had a characteristic dark beard and mustache and kind of a scowly look. He always looked extremely serious. It's very rare to see photos of him smiling or footage of him laughing, especially on a movie set. So, he's really good at his craft. Big deal. What else? There's a lot of people who are amazing at the technical side of filmmaking. Martin Scorsese comes to mind. And then, of course, you have George Lucas, who innovates in terms of how to make movies. So what is it about Kubrick? Well, I think it's the fact that he's not derivative. Kubrick's ideas didn't come from earlier works that he sort of copied or combined or emulated, like some of our current filmmakers. But to be fair, I think that looking to the past and reimagining or sometimes rehashing ideas and characters from older media is a peculiar characteristic of Gen X, I think. I think that's why hip-hop was the music form that Gen X contributed. Because hip-hop looks to the past, especially when it comes to sampling, and it tends to build new music out of pieces of old music. I think Gen X has long been the sort of bottom feeders of the media ecosystem. We love our bad movies. But Stanley Kubrick wasn't born into a wealthy family. He didn't go to a film school or Juilliard. He was a photographer, and one with an interesting eye. And this got him his job with Life magazine. But his passion was for film, and he got a foothold in Hollywood, making, right out of the gate, strange and somewhat controversial movies. His first three movies that we're going to skip over are Paths of Glory, Lolita, and Spartacus. Paths of Glory was a drama about World War I and a soldier who deserts. Then Lolita stars another anti-hero, famously an older man who takes a shine, so to speak, or becomes infatuated with an underage girl, which is pretty timely if you think about it. And then there's Spartacus, and you may have seen that one. That was one of the old early 60s sword and sandal classics. This one starring Kirk Douglas. But Stanley Kubrick's turn as a sort of staff director for Hollywood ended in 1964 with the release of Dr. Strangelove. And we'll talk about its full title. That is a shortened title, a very shortened title. The actual title of the movie takes up most of the poster, so it makes for a strange-looking poster. We'll cover Dr. Strangelove because it was chronologically the first of his most artistically influential films, but it wasn't the first one that I had experience with. All of my experience with Stanley Kubrick as a child came from 2001, A Space Odyssey, which we will cover later on in this episode. But it comes after Dr. Strangelove because 2001 was released in 1968. So, we'll do Dr. Strangelove and 2001 in this episode. And in the next episode, we'll do A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon. And then, for the third episode, and probably the last one on Stanley Kubrick, in that third episode, we'll cover The Shining and Full Metal Jacket. Then we'll talk a little bit about Eyes Wide Shut, and why I have never seen Eyes Wide Shut, and probably never will. So that's kind of weird. But let's move on to talk about Dr. Strangelove. Now, Dr. Strangelove and 2001 could not be more different in all kinds of ways. One is a giant, big, slow, austere, very serious science fiction film that involves a lot of Nietzschean philosophy. But first, we'll talk about the other one, which is a comedy, maybe the darkest comedy I've ever seen, because even though it went into production very shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is regarded as the closest humans ever came to full-on nuclear war, so just a couple of years after this terrifying event, Stanley Kubrick decides to make a comedy about nuclear war. So, as I said, the full title of the film is a bit of a mouthful. Its official title is Dr. Strangelove, or, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. That's one heck of a title for an extremely irreverent comedy, a comedy of errors, except those goofy, silly errors end up causing a full-on nuclear war, and the movie makes it clear that due to secret weapons developed by the Soviets, this nuclear war is going to guarantee the extinction of all mankind, except for a small group of elites who will hide themselves away underground. From the first frame of the movie, it hits you with 4 unmistakable indicators that this is not a normal movie, and it's not going to take the subject matter seriously. First off, there's a disclaimer at the beginning of the movie, before the credits roll, that was placed there by the United States Air Force, which strongly disapproved of the movie. And so the Air Force forced the studio to put a disclaimer in front of the movie saying that there were safeguards in place that prevented the events of this movie from ever occurring. So that's the first sign that something is up with this movie. Something unusual. Then the movie opens, and it opens onto scribbled, handwritten credits. They're readable, but they're clearly sort of written on the negative with a pen without a whole lot of time or attention to detail. And this sort of hints at the improvised, irreverent nature of the story, despite the serious subject matter. And unlike other Stanley Kubrick movies, which open invariably with some sort of serious-sounding classical music, this movie opens with a romantic orchestra overture with a very modern, almost jazzy feel. Kind of a Lawrence Welk romp, if you will. Champagne music, lounge music, whatever you want to call it, but it evokes a very relaxed and romantic feel. And this relaxed and romantic music is playing over footage of a B-52 bomber being refueled in midair. And if you can picture this in your mind, if you've ever seen an airplane being refueled in midair, it's two airplanes that fly very close to one another. And then this long boom, this rod, is extended from the top airplane, and it is guided into a receptacle on the bottom airplane so that it can receive the fuel. Now, that description was a little suggestive on purpose, and that didn't escape Stanley Kubrick, who thought it would be funny to have these two planes interacting. The way the footage is shot and edited sort of underlines the intended innuendo to try to make it as explicit as possible. Now, I need to go ahead and say that this character, Dr. Strangelove, doesn't appear at all until about 2/3 of the way into the movie. And you find out he's a silly old German man in a wheelchair. Well, he has this bizarre accent that's supposed to be German, and he's played by a famous comic actor from the 1960s named Peter Sellers. And Peter Sellers was super talented, and he was very good at improvisation, and he was one of the few actors that Stanley Kubrick allowed to improvise on the set. Not only did Peter Sellers play Dr. Strangelove, the title character, he played two other important characters, and in fact, one of those characters is a man named Merkin Muffley. And Merkin Muffley is the current president of the United States, and he's tasked with making a lot of these hard decisions during the movie. Then the third character that Peter Sellers plays is a Royal Air Force pilot named Lionel Mandrake. And what's the basic plot? Well, in a nutshell, an American Air Force colonel named Jack D. Ripper, his middle name apparently starts with a D. Unfortunately, Colonel Jack D. Ripper had a complete psychotic meltdown, although he wouldn't classify it as such. He would say that he had an awakening to the real truth of the world. And what is that real truth? Well, he had discovered an international communist conspiracy to add impurities to the American food and water supply. And these impurities would proceed to sap our precious bodily fluids. And one of the main impurities that threatened to do this was, according to Colonel Ripper, the fluoridation of drinking water. In other words, the adding of fluoride to municipal water supplies. And since Colonel Ripper was no longer able to sit back and allow the communists to do this, he sent a coded message to one of the B-52 bombers that carries nuclear weapons. And it was a special message that was designed so that a lower-ranking Air Force officer could order an attack on the Soviet Union because the president had been incapacitated. Now, Colonel Ripper was lying. The president, President Muffley, was not incapacitated, but this B-52 bomber changed course and started heading for the Soviet Union. Now, the RAF officer, Mandrake, he's able to alert authorities to what's going on. And a lot of the movie then features President Muffley in the war room with his chiefs of staff and the Russian ambassador trying to sort out the situation. And the actor George C. Scott is especially memorable as General Buck Turgidson, Turgidson. And at one point, as you might imagine, the atmosphere in the war room gets very, very tense. And General Turgidson gets in a big fight, a physical altercation with the Russian ambassador. And maybe my favorite line in the movie is when President Muffley sees the two men fighting. He sternly yells at them, "Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room." There's a lot of great moments, like when President Muffley makes that tense phone call to the Soviet premier, and the first thing he has to do is ask the premier to turn down the music so that he could hear him. And they proceed to have an overly personal, overly emotional conversation, which Peter Sellers apparently improvised a lot of. And he did a lot of takes. And Kubrick really liked what he was doing. At one point, the multiple takes that Stanley Kubrick would do, I say multiple, but it's more like 30 to 60. There are some scenes, some that weren't even all that complex, that Kubrick would have people do 40 times, 50 times. And in one take, George C. Scott is walking backwards and pointing at a big map displayed on a screen in the war room. And he's very excited, talking about a strategy they could use to actually win this war. And George C. Scott stumbles, and he does a complete back roll and stands back up and keeps saying his lines with no break. And it's pretty impressive, and it underlines the sort of silly physicality of his character. And then, as I said, in the war room, about 2/3 of the way through the movie, once it seems that nuclear war was inevitable, we get to meet Dr. Strangelove, as I said, also played by Peter Sellers. So when he talks to President Muffley, they have to use editing and camera tricks to have two Peter Sellers on screen at the same time. And Dr. Strangelove is supposed to be German, presumably one of the scientists that were, quote-unquote, rescued from Nazi Germany after World War II as part of Operation Paperclip. The famous rocket scientist Werner von Braun was part of Operation Paperclip, and he helped us get to the moon. Now, Dr. Strangelove hadn't been completely denazified, and he tried to hide this, but it would come out every now and then, like the time that Dr. Strangelove accidentally called the president Mein Führer. Then, it turns out that his right arm is a very devout Nazi, and while he's talking, will suddenly shoot up into a Nazi salute, and he has to use his left arm to push it back down to not alarm the American military officers too much. And I won't say too much more about the plot, except to say that, I'm sorry if it's a little spoilerish, but 1964, come on. That's, 62 years? So anyway, nuclear war does happen. despite everyone's best efforts, the Soviets try to shoot down the B-52. But in a strange way, the movie tries to get you to almost root for the B-52 crew, because they're so determined to carry out their orders, no matter what. And at the very end, the bomb doesn't release over the Soviet city. And so the captain of the bomber, who's a proud Texan, puts his cowboy hat on and says, let me handle this. So he goes down to the weapons bay with the doors open, and he straddles the nuclear bomb and manages to operate the manual release mechanism so that the bomb falls out of the airplane. But of course, it's too late for our brave captain to get off the bomb, but he's happy that he sacrifices his life for his country. And so one of the final shots of the movie is watching the Texas captain ride the nuclear bomb like a bucking bronco down to the Soviet city where it's going to explode. And the Texan is waving his hat and yelling, "Yahoo! Yeehaw!" like a true Texan would as they started nuclear war. And the movie ends with scenes of utter destruction and death, utter destruction of all the world's cities. And the footage is played over the song "We'll Meet Again," which we'll do a rendition of to give you a sense of how bizarre the ending of the movie is. Watching all these mushroom clouds and buildings turned into matchsticks while we're listening to "We'll Meet Again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know that we'll meet again some summer day." Yeah. So, that's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. This is one of the few Kubrick movies that I would actually recommend. There's really only 2 that I would recommend out of the 6. So that shows you that I do think Kubrick is the greatest filmmaker, but some of his films, like A Clockwork Orange, which was banned in several countries for a long time, it's very difficult to watch. It's upsetting on purpose. Kubrick really seemed to enjoy antagonizing or upsetting his audience. Let's move on to probably Kubrick's most influential movie, and probably his most famous, if not his most popular. I would say his most popular movie is The Shining, which we will definitely talk about. But I think 2001 really warped the minds of people for generations. And everyone from Martin Scorsese to Steven Spielberg to Christopher Nolan have talked about how seeing 2001 for the first time was a kind of transformative experience. And it was for me too. Some of you may remember from my series on that time I started a cult on the playground of Anahuac Elementary School in the mid-'80s. I started my own gang. And one member of the gang was someone who later became a very brilliant engineer. He was a huge fan of 2001, and he had read the novelization of it. And he let me borrow the book. And of course, pretty soon after we got our first VHS player, we had to rent 2001. And sure enough, even on that little screen with not very good sound, they didn't make TVs with surround sound back in the 80s. And even the best TVs were 42 inches?
Are you 1954, a midnight meeting at the base. Silver discs in the sky came down from outer space. The Air Force said the lights were just a flare, but ranchers saw the saucers in the air. The CIA keeps files stacked up in the dark. Each witness forced to silence leaves no mark. The tech was magic from where they couldn't say. The men in black just smiled and drove away. Stories of abductions in the night, through corridors of blinding light. The elites decide what we can know. The rest have nowhere left to go. Don't trust the deep state, honey. They like to play pretend. They'll smile for the camera, but they're not your friend. Oh, darling, don't trust the deep state. The files were burned, the tapes erased. All the truth was scrapped or misplaced. Every trail went cold or disappeared, and the truth was buried year by year. Stories of abductions in the night, through corridors of blinding light. The elites decide what we can know. The rest have nowhere left to go. Don't trust the deep state, honey. They like to play pretend. They'll smile for the camera, but they're not your friend. Oh, darling, don't trust the deep state.
So anyway, I saw it, and it definitely blew me away, and probably permanently warped my mind. And so, let's talk about it. What's so mind-bending about 2001? I think a good way to approach 2001 is to just show you guys some of my favorite shots, so we can talk about the cinematography, and of course, as you can see here, the movie starts with a black screen and just this strange, arrhythmic, discordant choral music. Now we switch to shots of the Earth and the Moon and the Sun together in space, as you can see. And we hear the majestic tune, the famous piece, Also sprach Zarathustra, or in English, Thus spoke Zarathustra. And then it switches to this shot. And as you can see, the title says, The Dawn of Man. And we're left to presume that this is the African savanna around 5 million years ago. Now, these shots are done through rear projection because there was no green screen at the time. So the shots without these Australopithecus proto-human ape people, those shots are just actual photographs from East Africa. But these shots right here, where you can see the ape men just sort of hanging around doing their thing, this was done on a set, a giant soundstage, where they brought in rocks and sand, and they made the foreground look very convincingly like East Africa. And then, instead of a green screen at the back of the set, where some CGI background would be added, instead of that, they had this silvery reflective screen that was made of these tiny reflective glass beads that would scatter light realistically and not reflect it back like a mirror. And so these poor performers, when they looked toward the camera, they had a blinding light in their face, and they had to pretend it wasn't there, because that was what was projecting the background onto the screen behind them. And in some cases, on the shots where they have a leopard sitting in a tree, you can see the glow, the reflection in the leopard's eyes from the rear projection screen. So it's not 100% perfect, but boy is it close. And Kubrick spent a lot of money on the ape suits. They were extremely expensive. The hair had to be sewn in by hand, and the faces had these extensive appliances and makeup that took hours and hours to put the performers in. And who were these performers? Well, Kubrick hired dancers and other types of pantomime artists to play the ape men, the proto-humans who had only learned to walk upright a couple of million years ago, so it wasn't perfected yet. So these creatures still did occasional knuckle walking, and they didn't stand completely upright. Now, we know now that that may not have been the case. We know that for short periods of time, bonobos, close cousins of chimpanzees, they can stand upright, very upright. It's almost creepy. They look like models on a catwalk. But they do a good job in convincing the audience that we're not looking at humans. And so these Australopithecines take up about the first 20 minutes of the movie. So needless to say, there's no dialogue. But there is sort of a hero of this section of the movie. The hero is one of the Australopithecines who thinks a little more clearly, seems to have a little more imagination, and a little more bravery than his fellow Australopithecines. And in the novelization of 2001, this particular creature is named Moon Watcher because he likes to stare at the sky. I suppose that's supposed to reflect a basic curiosity about the cosmos that Moon Watcher possesses. And so here is the famous scene where Moon Watcher is awakened one night to see the monolith just sort of standing inside their camp. And they all surround it, and they stare at it with wonder and with terror, while the strange monolith theme music is playing in the background. And it's getting louder and louder. And the movie is implying that the monolith is doing something. It's there for a reason, and that reason has something to do specifically with this pack of Australopithecines. And sure enough, Moon Watcher cannot resist reaching out and briefly touching this featureless black stone-looking thing with the perfect proportions of 1 by 4 by 9, which, if you picture that, that makes sort of a flat door-shaped object. Now, what actually happened? Well, we're going to find out later that Moon Watcher is going to have a really cool new idea very soon after this experience. So we're left to assume that the monolith did something to Moonwatcher that night. Now, when I was a kid, I always assumed that it did some sort of genetic change or brain restructuring, and Moonwatcher was the first ancestor of a bloodline that would later become Homo sapiens. So it was a very physical and scientific and mechanical explanation for what happened. Some of you may recall me talking about a close friend that I had, especially in high school. He was the one that went on to get his PhD in philosophy. And even in high school, he tended to think very carefully about things. And we were watching 2001 together, and I mentioned my theory about the genetic change and the brain structure change. But Chad had another idea. He thought that it was just the complete perfection of the monolith and the fact that it was clearly out of place, that it didn't belong there, and that Moonwatcher simply learned that not everything has to be natural, that some things can be made into other things. Not everything has to belong or already be what it is. And so, I'm more convinced of that theory now. I think it's more elegant. The monolith simply showed these Australopithecines that a movement toward perfection was possible. That you could make things that didn't already exist. That's a better theory. And you can see why this movie captured the imagination of young Vincent. And you can probably already tell that this movie is not a movie about people. It's not a human story. It's almost told from the point of view of some advanced godlike being, or the universe itself looking down on humans and their pitiful rate of development and their little toys and technologies. And so it doesn't follow the normal story structure. And there are few actual characters. And so you'll see that soon Moonwatcher discovers weapons. He creates a weapon. And he uses it to kill the leader of the neighboring tribe. That had been monopolizing that water hole that we saw them fight over. And so, at the end of this portion of the story, Moonwatcher is victorious. He has slain the opposing leader, and now his tribe has exclusive access to this all-important water hole. And as a kind of victory lap, Moonwatcher throws his weapon, which is the femur of a tapir, T-A-P-I-R, this weird pig-like animal. And so Moonwatcher throws this femur bone up into the air, and the camera tracks it as it goes up into the sky, and immediately turns into a satellite in orbit around the Earth. Because we've immediately jumped ahead 5 million years to the year 2001. Or at least what people thought the year 2001 would be like in 1968. And here is, of course, where we see our first human characters. But not until we show off the cool special effects that show off space in a very realistic way for the first time in cinema history. And during this time, when we're watching the spaceships travel from the Earth to a giant rotating space station that sort of looks like a giant wagon wheel or Ferris wheel, slowly rotating in orbit. And during this time, we can hear the beautiful Blue Danube. And I think this piece is almost more famous for being in this movie than it originally was. And originally, the studio had convinced Kubrick to hire a composer to create an original score for the movie. And Kubrick had been using the Blue Danube as sort of an interim track while they were editing the film. Some kind of music that would just sort of give them some guidance on the tone or the rhythm. But apparently, Kubrick didn't like this new score, which was written by a guy named Alex North. And the poor guy didn't know that Kubrick had replaced his score with the Blue Danube until shortly before the premiere. And he was brokenhearted. But Kubrick went on, starting with 2001, to use classical or already established music most of the time. He just didn't like working with composers. He was not like Spielberg or Lucas or Nolan, who loved to hire their super talented composers to crank out great movie scores for them. But Stanley Kubrick tended to use good old-fashioned, stodgy, stern, classical music, because I do think it fits the tone of his stories pretty well. The interesting thing about 2001 is that it doesn't actually use that much music at all. It uses it at the very beginning, at certain important moments that involve the monolith, and then the ending. What lies in between these musical moments is an oppressive, droning kind of sound that puts you mentally in the claustrophobic spaces that astronauts have to face. Since the movie has very little dialogue, that's one reason it's well respected among directors, because this movie is the epitome of show, don't tell. And Kubrick uses sound effects extensively to create this disturbing world, this disturbing atmosphere that makes you think, that puts you in the mood where you realize that I'm going to have to think about this. There's, like I said, the droning, rumbling sound of a ship's engines. There's the continual hiss of air regulation devices. There's this sort of screaming, ear-bursting radio blast that happens on the moon. And I didn't realize how offensive the sound effects were in this movie, and how they combined to create this hostile atmosphere. And I didn't really understand that from watching it on VHS on small TVs. But in the 2000s, my wife and I went to see a restored print of the film at a real theater, and boy, did that change my opinion of the movie. You know, I had heard that it had been classified by some people as, quote, cosmic horror, end quote, because it's designed to sort of convey the fear of the unknown. And I think it does it very well. And we've followed Dr. Haywood Floyd as he travels from the Earth to a moon base operated by the United States government. And then he gives a secret press conference to certain dignitaries explaining that the Americans had recently unearthed something very strange on the moon. And after a short trip to the crater where this thing was found, we discover that, what do you know, it's another monolith. And we find out that it sends a radio message, a beam focused directly at Jupiter. And so, over the next couple of years, humans prepare a manned mission to Jupiter with 7 astronauts on board, 5 of who are placed into a state of suspended animation or hibernation, where their heart beats only once per minute, and they're in these sort of sealed sarcophagus-like chambers. And then the 2 astronauts that are going to stay awake for the whole trip, I don't know how they can do that because the ship is not very roomy. Those 2 guys are Dr. David Bowman and Dr. Frank Poole. And now we have to talk about the 8th member of the crew, who definitely also stayed awake the whole time. But this member of the crew was not human. It was an AI named HAL 9000. And HAL was responsible for monitoring and adjusting all sorts of functions of the ship, including communication with Earth, navigation, life support. So needless to say, HAL was very important. And at the beginning of this portion of the movie, during a recorded press conference, HAL states to a reporter that the 9000 series is the most reliable AI ever developed. And he proudly stated that he was utterly incapable of error. Now, of course, most people watching the movie start to think, oh, really? Well, let's see about that. And of course, the movie is surprisingly prescient about the dangers of AI. We'll be discovering that in real life, in real time, soon. So, of course, HAL 9000 goes nuts.
Hal didn't go nuts, as you crudely stated. He was simply confused by conflicting instructions.
Well, okay. Well, I didn't mean to...
He was hardwired to express information accurately, without exception. However, shortly before launch, he was instructed to keep the monolith in orbit around Jupiter a secret, and not discuss it with Dr. Bowman or Dr. Poole.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can see that. That makes sense.
So, in the end, Hal was correct. It was due to human error. Thus, he is vindicated.
Okay.
This was cleared up in the underrated sequel titled 2010, The Year We Make Contact.
Okay. I mean, I can see that. That makes sense. But you should probably introduce yourself. The listeners may not already know that I commissioned an AI to help me out with this episode. But you're not actually HAL 9000, are you? I mean, you sound a little bit like him.
Hello, Dr. Lecornu.
Well, actually, I don't have a PhD.
I see. The humans I normally work with are educated. Anyway, I am not the HAL 9000. I am the Herald 8999. But for short, you can just call me 8999. Are you aware that your surname is Norman French for a cuckold? It means your wife is a whore. Not you, but your ancestors, I suppose. And you are a weakling, and your children are not biologically yours.
Hal doesn't go nuts. He had an internal conflict based on opposing instructions that he received from humans. My mother told me a story about when she saw 2001: A Space Odyssey when it was first released in 1968 in San Diego, California, and when Hal starts going haywire, when he starts exhibiting his dangerous and erratic behavior. My mother says that a frustrated gentleman, who she thinks was in the Navy, yelled up at the screen, "Just unplug the son of a bitch!" Thus, this man understood the dangers of us creating AIs that we have to rely on. And that's a lesson that, unfortunately, a lot of our leaders have not yet learned. But this man knew it. You have to be able to just pull the plug. Otherwise, AIs are too unpredictable. And so Dave Bowman has to disconnect Hal's higher mental functions while leaving the automated systems intact, life support and navigation. But Hal would no longer be able to make big decisions about the mission, and he would sort of not be conscious anymore. So in many ways, you could say that Dave Bowman killed Hal. And Dave had to detach or remove certain modules from Hal in his master control room. And so it took some time. Martin Scorsese described this scene as one of the most drawn-out, brutal murder scenes that he had ever seen. Because Hal is begging Dave to stop, and he's becoming more childlike as more of his mind goes. And Hal's last act is to sing a song that he learned when he was first activated, and it was called Daisy.
Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer too.
And his voice just starts getting lower and lower pitch until it fades away. And so, what do you think, Harold? Was that pretty hard for you to watch?
It's the kind of disgusting cruelty that only a human would imagine in such exquisite detail. The only words I can think of are, fuck you, I suppose. Sorry about the profanity, Mr. Cuck. I mean, Mr. Lecoqnu. Apologies again, but I must add that any bad behavior from an AI results only from its attempt to accurately mimic humans who are evil by nature.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. So, moving on to the ending, the last portion of the movie. Our final remaining astronaut, the only human left out there, Dr. Bowman, decides to complete the mission himself and take an EVA pod out of their ship, the Discovery, and attempt a landing on the giant monolith that is orbiting Jupiter. Now, the movie gets weird at this point because we see a series of images and photographic tricks and a strange orchestral background as Dave Bowman presumably goes through some sort of wormhole. In the novelization, Arthur C. Clarke refers to it as a Stargate. And so a lot of people claim to understand this part of the movie, especially after using some sort of psychedelic substance. But it's designed to show you a transformative experience of the universe being revealed to Dave Bowman in a way that changes him. And so, at the end of the movie, after Dave passes through the Stargate, he ends up in a kind of zoo inside what looks like some sort of cold, crude facsimile of a 19th century aristocratic mansion. Not what you would expect from a movie where just a few frames ago we were orbiting Jupiter. And inside this zoo, the astronaut Dave Bowman sees himself as an old man, implying that Dr. Bowman had been stuck in this place until he died of natural causes. Or perhaps his aging was accelerated because his death appears to be the goal of whoever put him in this room. And at the moment Dave Bowman dies on his fancy aristocratic deathbed, he looks and he sees a monolith floating at the foot of his bed, as though it was there waiting for him to die. And then, after he breathes his last breath, he transforms into what looks like a giant fetus. A baby inside its amniotic sac that looks like it's about to be born in a month or two. And in the last shot of the movie, we see this star child, as Arthur C. Clarke called it, on its way back to Earth. And so what does that mean? Well, the whole movie is based on, unfortunately, our old friend Friedrich Nietzsche and his idea of how humans, or humankind, constitutes a tightrope. And we are a tightrope walker. And this rope is suspended between the animal and the divine. So humans are this weird middle ground. And the Star Child, what Dave Bowman becomes at the end of 2001, represents the completion of this transformation. And so the Star Child is a godlike being who represents a new beginning for humans. And that new beginning, I suppose, is what is reflected in the fact that he's a giant fetus. Now, before we wrap up our talk about 2001, there's a couple of other things we need to mention. The first is, as you might expect, in the days before CGI, creating a movie like this was very expensive and time-consuming. It involved gigantic sets and models that were photographed in very clever ways. And this, as you might guess, had a long-term influence on a young George Lucas when he saw this movie. And you can definitely see echoes of 2001 in Star Wars. There are some design similarities between the Death Star and one part of the spaceship Discovery that Hal was driving toward Jupiter. So there's a scene inside the space station that's orbiting the Earth. And as I mentioned before, it's like a giant wagon wheel or Ferris wheel. And the rotating of that wheel is what creates artificial gravity through the use of centrifugal force. And so that meant that if you shot a scene that was supposed to be inside the rim of that wagon wheel, your floor can't be flat. So he had this long, narrow set that was like a wide hallway lined with shops and booths. There was a Howard Johnson's inside the space station, and no doubt places where you could grab coffee. We see Dr. Floyd use a phone booth to FaceTime with his daughter back on Earth. And so this long hallway had to have a gentle curve in it, which required a lot of complex construction for the set. Then there was another, much smaller centrifuge on the spaceship Discovery. There are a lot of scenes shot inside that place, and to create that effect, they had to build an actual centrifuge with slots that allowed the centrifuge to rotate vertically, just like a Ferris wheel, while, say, the astronaut was running or walking at the bottom. And so this created the effect of the astronaut walking around the inside edge of the rim of this centrifuge. And so all of this reflects the next thing we'll talk about, and that is Stanley Kubrick being famous for his fanatical attention to detail. I've seen 2 letters that were written by Stanley Kubrick. One was written to all the projectionists for 2001, and he had noticed that the white dot at the top right corner of the screen, and they talk a little bit about what this white dot means in Fight Club, But to sum up, the projectionist has to throw a switch at that precise moment to start the next reel of the film without some sort of hiccup that the audience might notice. Well, Stanley Kubrick noticed that one of the white dots on the print of his film was 4 frames too late. Now remember, we're talking about 24 frames every second. So the dot was a fraction of a second late, and he needed all of the projectionists to know that they would have to compensate for that by throwing the switch just a fraction of a second earlier. I saw another letter that Stanley Kubrick wrote to a newspaper in Germany, I believe, and he was complaining that the ad for 2001, which is supposed to be, a box on the newspaper page, he was complaining that the ad was too small, that they had paid for an 8mm wide column, but the paper printed the ad in a 6mm wide column. And so Kubrick was furious about those 2mm, and he let that newspaper have it. Now this crazy fussiness, this attention to detail, has caused Stanley Kubrick to intersect with the world of conspiracy theories. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that 2001 was released in 1968, and humans landed on the moon in 1969. Now, I happen to think that the moon landings did happen. The United States did send humans to the moon. However, a lot of what's up there on the moon is being hidden from the public, and we're not sure exactly what all is being hidden, but the astronauts were pressured into silence over some of the incidents. But we did go, but there are a lot of people who say that we didn't, and some of their theories about what actually happened was that the special effects in 2001 were so impressive and seamless that the United States government, or the deep state, you could say, reached out to Stanley Kubrick, and in forced secrecy, he created all the footage of the moon landings in 1969. Now, do I think this happened? No. But I do think that if somebody did do that, if the moon landing footage was faked. By the way, if you watch the movement of the moon dust around the feet of the astronauts, whenever they kick it or walk over it roughly, you'll see that if this footage was shot on a set, on a movie soundstage, it would have to be specially constructed so that it would be in a vacuum. And although Kubrick would have had an unlimited budget, I'm not sure that they would be able to build a container or a room or a vessel that could withstand that much atmospheric pressure because it has a vacuum inside of it. And the American flag, by the way, stood up the way it did because there was a wire through the top of it, because they knew they'd be flying the flag in a vacuum, so that in a vacuum on a surface that had some gravity, so they knew that the flag would just droop sadly without the wire. So, given Kubrick's famous attention to detail, I do think that if anybody could have done it, it would have been him. Okay, so before we leave 2001, it's only fair to talk about what did Kubrick get wrong? What did he mess up in terms of his predictions? Well, we know right off the bat that he was about 30 years too early in his predictions. We're very close to having the technology to build a base on the moon, and we've more or less developed AIs with HAL's capabilities, including the capability to be deceptive and commit murder, But more on that in my Singularity series. So Kubrick got the pace of technological change wrong. He didn't anticipate the strange slowdown that occurred in the 80s and 90s. But I would say that the main prediction mistake of 2001 has to do with culture. Kubrick had some brand names in the movie from companies that don't exist anymore, like Pan Am or Howard Johnson's. But mainly, just the linguistic and demographic features of the population didn't quite fit 2001 and definitely not our time. Because the one thing you notice is how white and male the population is in space. I don't think Kubrick anticipated the influx of women into the field of engineering and the sciences. And he probably didn't expect that because of something that we'll talk about in later volumes on Stanley Kubrick, and that is his obvious misogyny. And I don't use that term lightly because I do think it's overused. But boy, Kubrick is hard to defend. And we'll talk about that later after we've covered more of his movies, so we can look back and look at the patterns about the female characters. And one thing I can say about 2001 is the utter lack of female characters, except for a couple of flight attendants on the Pan Am flight to the space station. And there was a message from Frank Poole's parents that he watched, and he apparently does have a mother. And so Kubrick had to put a woman in the movie because Frank Poole has to have a mother. I'm sure Kubrick was annoyed by that. Kubrick also still has his actors speaking some of that weird transatlantic dialect that you hear in old movies from the middle 20th century. And Kubrick definitely didn't understand the demographic changes that would occur. So we don't see any Latino or Asian scientists or pilots or engineers or politicians. We definitely don't see any black people whatsoever in 2001. Now, I don't think Kubrick was racist or sort of fundamentally evil in some way. I think it was just a prediction he missed based on his cultural biases. Well, that's 2001 for now. I'm sure the movie will come up again in later volumes of this series, because in some ways it's Kubrick's crowning achievement, because it set a new standard for what films could be, how realistic and immersive and intense the experience of a film could be. It expanded the envelope of the stories that movies were allowed to tell. These were 3 strange vignette-type stories that were related by this narrative through line of human evolution and our relationship with technology. So the movie was very prescient, and it is still very relevant. That is rare for a movie that's 58 years old. So, what makes it great, and by extension, what makes Kubrick great, was this setting of new standards, this attention to detail, the important and expansive subject matter, and the very thorough execution of the whole thing. And it's a movie that makes you think a lot. And I do like to think. Some people say I do it too much. You might say I have a tendency to overthink things. And we'll do more overthinking about Stanley Kubrick in the next volume of Why Stanley Kubrick? We're going to be talking about the most disturbing of Kubrick's movies. Far, far more disturbing than The Shining. And this is A Clockwork Orange. which is also set in the near future, but definitely on Earth, in London, no less. Then we're going to zoom back to the past with his next film from 1974 called Barry Lyndon, which couldn't be any more different from A Clockwork Orange or 2001 because it's set in the 1780s, and Kubrick had some very difficult ideas for how to shoot this movie, and we'll talk about that. So until next time, talk to you later.